Chapter 14. The Long-Eared Hearer Learns by Listening. During this time, Ruggedo, the metal monarch and king of the gnomes, was trying to amuse himself in his splendid jeweled cavern. It was hard work for Ruggedo to find amusement today, for all the gnomes were behaving well, and there was no one to scold or to punish. The king had thrown his scepter at Calico 6 times, without hitting him once. Not that Calico had done anything wrong. On the contrary, he had obeyed the king in every way but one. He would not stand still when commanded to do so, and let the heavy scepter strike him. We can hardly blame Calico for this, and even the cruel Ruggedo forgave him, for he knew very well that if he mashed his royal chamberlain, he could never find another so intelligent and obedient. Calico could make the gnomes work when their king could not, for the gnomes hated Ruggedo, and there were so many thousands of the quaint little underground people that they could easily have rebelled and defied the king had they dared to do so. Sometimes, when Ruggedo abused them worse than usual, they grew sullen and threw down their hammers and picks. Then, however hard the king scolded or whipped them, they would not work until Calico came and begged them to. For Calico was one of themselves and was as much abused by the king as any gnome in the vast series of caverns. But today, all the little people were working industriously at their tasks, and Ruggedo, having nothing to do, was greatly bored. He sent for the long-eared hearer and asked him to listen carefully and report what was going on in the big world. "It seems," said the hearer, after listening for a while, "that the women in America have clubs." "Are there spikes in them?" asked Ruggedo, yawning. "I cannot hear any spikes, your majesty," was the reply. "Then their clubs are not as good as my scepter. What else do you hear?" "There's a war." "Ah, there's always a war. What else?" For a time the hearer was silent, bending forward and spreading out his big ears to catch the slightest sound. Then suddenly he said, "Here is an interesting thing, your majesty. These people are arguing as to who shall conquer the metal monarch, seize his treasure, and drive him from his dominions." "What people?" demanded Ruggedo, sitting up straight in his throne. "The ones you threw down the hollow tube." "Where are they now?" "In the same tube, and coming back this way," said the hearer. Ruggedo got out of his throne and began to pace up and down the cavern. "I wonder what can be done to stop them," he mused. "Well," said the hearer, "if you could turn the tube upside down, they would be falling the other way, your majesty." Ruggedo glared at him wickedly, for it was impossible to turn the tube upside down, and he believed the hearer was slyly poking fun at him. Presently he asked, "How far away are those people now?" "About 9,306 miles, 17 furlongs, 8 feet and 4 inches, as nearly as I can judge from the sound of their voices," replied the hearer. "Aha! Then it will be some time before they arrive," said Ruggedo, "and when they get here, I shall be ready to receive them." He rushed to his gong and pounded upon it so fiercely that Calico came bounding into the cavern with one shoe off and one shoe on, for he was just dressing himself after a swim in the hot, bubbling lake of the underground kingdom. "Calico, those invaders whom we threw down the tube are coming back again," he exclaimed. "I thought they would," said the royal chamberlain, pulling on the other shoe. "Tititi-Hoochoo would not allow them to remain in his kingdom, of course, and so I've been expecting them back for some time." "That was a very foolish action of yours, Rug." "What, to throw them down the tube?" "Yes. Tititi-Hoochoo has forbidden us to throw even rubbish into the tube." "Oh, what do I care for the Jinjun?" asked Ruggedo scornfully. "He never leaves his own kingdom, which is on the other side of the world." "True, but he might send someone through the tube to punish you," suggested Calico. "I'd like to see him do it." Who would conquer my thousands of gnomes?" "Why, they've been conquered before, if I remember right," answered Calico with a grin. "Once I saw you running from a little girl named Dorothy and her friends, as if you were really afraid." "Well, I was afraid that time," admitted the Nome King, with a deep sigh, for Dorothy had a yellow hen that laid eggs. The king shuddered as he said, "Eggs," and Calico shuddered also, and so did the long-eared hearer, for eggs are the only things that the gnomes greatly dread. The reason for this is that eggs belong on the earth's surface, where birds and fowl of all sorts live, and there is something about a hen's egg, especially, that fills a gnome with horror. If by chance the inside of an egg touches one of these underground people, he withers up and blows away, and that is the end of him, unless he manages quickly to speak a magical word which only a few of the gnomes know. Therefore, Ruggedo and his followers had very good cause to shudder at the mere mention of eggs. "But Dorothy," said the king, "is not with this band of invaders, nor is the yellow hen. As for Tititi-Hoochoo, he has no means of knowing that we are afraid of eggs." "You mustn't be too sure of that," Calico warned him. "Tititi-Hoochoo knows a great many things, being a fairy, and his powers are far superior to any we can boast." Ruggedo shrugged impatiently and turned to the hearer. "Listen," said he, "and tell me if you hear any eggs coming through the tube." The long-eared one listened and then shook his head, but Calico laughed at the king. "No one can hear an egg, your majesty," said he. "The only way to discover the truth is to look through the magic spyglass." "That's it," cried the king. "Why didn't I think of it before? Look at once, Calico." So Calico went to the spyglass, and by uttering a mumbled charm, he caused the other end of it to twist around, so that it pointed down the opening of the tube. Then he put his eye to the glass, and was able to gaze along all the turns and windings of the magic spyglass, and then deep into the tube, to where our friends were at the time falling. "Dear me," he exclaimed, "here comes a dragon." "A big one?" asked Ruggedo. "A monster. He has an electric light on the end of his tail, so I can see him very plainly, and the other people are all riding upon his back." "How about the eggs?" inquired the king. Calico looked again. "I can see no eggs at all," said he, "but I imagine that the dragon is as dangerous as eggs. Probably Tititi-Hoochoo has sent him here to punish you for dropping those strangers into the forbidden tube. I warned you not to do it, your majesty." This news made the Nome King anxious. For a few minutes he paced up and down, stroking his long beard and thinking with all his might. After this he turned to Calico and said, "All the harm a dragon can do is to scratch with his claws and bite with his teeth." "That is not all, but it's quite enough," returned Calico earnestly. "On the other hand, no one can hurt a dragon, because he's the toughest creature alive. One flop of his huge tail could smash 100 gnomes to pancakes, and with teeth and claws he could tear even you or me into small bits, so that it would be almost impossible to put us together again. Once, a few hundred years ago, while wandering through some deserted caverns, I came upon a small piece of a gnome lying on the rocky floor. I asked the piece of gnome what had happened to it. Fortunately, the mouth was a part of this piece, the mouth and the left eye, so it was able to tell me that a fierce dragon was the cause. It had attacked the poor gnome and scattered him in every direction, and as there was no friend near to collect his pieces and put him together, they had been separated for a great many years. So you see, your majesty, it is not good taste to sneer at a dragon." The king had listened attentively to Calico. Said he, "It will only be necessary to chain this dragon which Tititi Hoochoo has sent here, in order to prevent his reaching us with his claws and teeth." "He also breathes flames," Calico reminded him. "My gnomes are not afraid of fire, nor am I," said Ruggedo. "Well, how about the army of Oogaboo? 16 cowardly officers and Tik-Tok. Why, I could defeat them single-handed, but I won't try to. I'll summon my armies of gnomes to drive the invaders out of my territory. And if we catch any of them, I intend to stick needles into them until they hop with pain." "I hope you won't hurt any of the girls," said Calico. "I'll hurt them all," roared the angry metal monarch. "And that braying mule I'll make into hoof soup and feed it to my gnomes, that it may add to their strength." "Why not be good to the strangers and release your prisoner, the Shaggy Man's brother?" suggested Calico. "Never! It may save you a lot of annoyance, and you don't want the ugly one." "I don't want him, that's true, but I won't allow anybody to order me around. I'm king of the gnomes, and I'm the metal monarch, and I shall do as I please, and what I please, and when I please." With this speech, Ruggedo threw his scepter at Calico's head, aiming it so well that the royal chamberlain had to fall flat upon the floor in order to escape it. But the hero did not see the scepter coming, and it swept past his head so closely that it broke off the tip of one of his long ears. He gave a dreadful yell that quite startled Ruggedo, and the king was sorry for the accident because those long ears of the hero were really valuable to him. So the Nome King forgot to be angry with Calico and ordered his chamberlain to summon General Guff and the army of gnomes and have them properly armed. They were then to march to the mouth of the tube where they could seize the travellers as soon as they appeared. Chapter 15. The Dragon Defies Danger. Although the journey through the tube was longer this time than before, it was so much more comfortable that none of our friends minded it at all. They talked together most of the time, and as they found the dragon good-natured and fond of the sound of his own voice, they soon became well acquainted with him and accepted him as a companion. "You see," said Shaggy in his frank way, "Quox is on our side, and therefore the dragon is a good fellow. If he happened to be an enemy, instead of a friend, I am sure I should dislike him very much, for his breath smells of brimstone. He is very conceited, and he's so strong and fierce that he would prove a dangerous foe." "Yes, indeed," returned Quox, who had listened to this speech with pleasure. "I suppose I am about as terrible as any living thing. I am glad you find me conceited, for that proves I know my good qualities. As for my breath smelling of brimstone, I really can't help it, and I once met a man whose breath smelled of onions, which I consider far worse." "I don't," said Betsy. "I love onions, and I love brimstone," declared the dragon, "so don't let us quarrel over one another's peculiarities." Saying this, he breathed a long breath and shot a flame 50 feet from his mouth. The brimstone made Betsy cough, but she remembered about the onions and said nothing. They had no idea how far they had gone through the center of the earth, nor when to expect the trip to end. At one time, the little girl remarked, "I wonder when we'll reach the bottom of this hole." And isn't it funny, Shaggy Man, that what is the bottom to us now was the top when we fell the other way? "What puzzles me," said Files, "is that we are able to fall both ways." "That," announced Tik-Tok, "is because the world is round." "Exactly," responded Shaggy. "The machinery in your head is in fine working order, Tik-Tok. You know, Betsy, that there is such a thing as the attraction of gravitation, which draws everything toward the center of the earth. That is why we fall out of bed and why everything clings to the surface of the earth." Then why doesn't everything go on down to the center of the earth? Inquired the little girl. I was afraid you were going to ask me that, replied Shaggy in a sad tone. The reason, my dear, is that the earth is so solid that other solid things can't get through it. But when there's a hole, as there is in this case, we drop right down to the center of the world. Why don't we stop there? Asked Betsy. Because we go so fast that we acquire speed enough to carry us right up to the other end. I don't understand that, and it makes my head ache to try to figure it out, she said after some thought. One thing draws us to the center, and another thing pushes us away from it. But don't ask me why, please, interrupted the Shaggy Man. If you can't understand it, let it go at that. Do you understand it? She inquired. All the magic isn't in fairyland, he said gravely. There's lots of magic in all nature, and you may see it as well in the United States, where you and I once lived, as you can here. I never did, she replied, because you were so used to it all that you didn't realize it was magic. Is anything more wonderful than to see a flower grow and blossom, or to get light out of the electricity in the air? The cows that manufacture milk for us must have machinery fully as remarkable as that in Tik-Tok's copper body, and perhaps you've noticed that. And then, before Shaggy could finish his speech, the strong light of day suddenly broke upon them, grew brighter, and completely enveloped them. The dragon's claws no longer scraped against the metal tube, for he shot into the open air 100 feet or more, and sailed so far away from the slanting hole that when he landed, it was on the peak of a mountain and just over the entrance to the many underground caverns of the Nome King. Some of the officers tumbled off their seats when Quox struck the ground, but most of the dragon's passengers only felt a slight jar. All were glad to be on solid earth again, and they at once dismounted and began to look about them. Queerly enough, as soon as they had left the dragon, the seats that were strapped to the monster's back disappeared. And this probably happened because there was no further use for them, and because Quox looked far more dignified in just his silver scales. Of course, he still wore the 40 yards of ribbon around his neck, as well as the great locket, but these only made him look dressed up, as Betsy remarked. Now the army of gnomes had gathered thickly around the mouth of the tube in order to be ready to capture the band of invaders as soon as they popped out. There were, indeed, hundreds of gnomes assembled, and they were led by Guff, their most famous general. But they did not expect the dragon to fly so high, and he shot out of the tube so suddenly that it took them by surprise. When the gnomes had rubbed the astonishment out of their eyes and regained their wits, they discovered the dragon quietly seated on the mountainside far above their heads, while the other strangers were standing in a group and calmly looking down upon them. General Guff was very angry at the escape, which was no one's fault but his own. "Come down here and be captured," he shouted, waving his sword at them. "Come up here and capture us if you dare," replied Queen Anne, who was winding up the clockwork of her private soldier, so he could fight more briskly. Guff's first answer was a roar of rage at the defiance. Then he turned and issued a command to his gnomes. These were all armed with sharp spears, and with one accord they raised these spears and threw them straight at their foes, so that they rushed through the air in a perfect cloud of flying weapons. Some damage might have been done had not the dragon quickly crawled before the others, his body being so big that it shielded every one of them, including Hank. The spears rattled against the silver scales of Quox, and then fell harmlessly to the ground. They were magic spears, of course, and all straightway bounded back into the hands of those who had thrown them, but even Guff could see that it was useless to repeat the attack. It was now Queen Anne's turn to attack, So the generals yelled, "Forward, march!" and the colonels and majors and captains repeated the command, and the valiant army of Oogaboo, which seemed to be composed mainly of Tik-Tok, marched forward in single column toward the gnomes, while Betsy and Polychrome cheered, and Hank gave a loud "Hee-haw!" and Shaggy shouted, "Hooray!" and Queen Anne screamed, "At 'em, Tik-Tok, at 'em!" The gnomes did not await the Clockwork Man's attack, but in a twinkling disappeared into the underground caverns. They made a great mistake in being so hasty, for Tik-Tok had not taken a dozen steps before he stubbed his copper toe on a rock and fell flat to the ground, where he cried, "Pick me up! Pick me up! Pick me up!" until Shaggy and Files ran forward and raised him to his feet again. The dragon chuckled softly to himself as he scratched his left ear with his hind claw, but no one was paying much attention to Quox just then. It was evident to Anne and her officers that there could be no fighting unless the enemy was present, and in order to find the enemy, they must boldly enter the underground kingdom of the gnomes. So bold a step demanded a council of war. "Don't you think I'd better drop in on Ruggido and obey the orders of Gin-Gin?" asked Quox. "By no means," returned Queen Anne. "We have already put the army of gnomes to flight, and all that yet remains is to force our way into those caverns and conquer the Nome King and all his people." "That seems to me something of a job," said the dragon, closing his eyes sleepily. "But go ahead if you like, and I'll wait here for you. Don't be in any hurry on my account. To one who lives thousands of years, the delay of a few days means nothing at all, and I shall probably sleep until the time comes for me to act." Anne was provoked at this speech. "You may as well go back to Titi-Hoochoo now," she said, "for the Nome King is as good as conquered already." But Quox shook his head. "No," said he, "I'll wait." Chapter 16. The Naughty Gnome. Shaggy Man had said nothing during the conversation between Queen Anne and Quox, for the simple reason that he did not consider the matter worth an argument. Safe within his pocket reposed a love magnet, which had never failed to win every heart. The gnomes, he knew, were not like the heartless roses, and therefore could be won to his side as soon as he exhibited the magic talisman. Shaggy's chief anxiety had been to reach Ruggido's kingdom, and now that the entrance lay before him, he was confident he would be able to rescue his lost brother. Let Anne and the dragon quarrel as to whom should conquer the gnomes, if they liked. Shaggy would let them try, and if they failed, he had the means of conquest in his own pocket. But Anne was positive she could not fail, for she thought her army could do anything. So she called the officers together and told them how to act, and she also instructed Tik-Tok what to do and what to say. "Please do not shoot your gun except as a last resort," she added, "for I do not wish to be cruel or to shed any blood, unless it is absolutely necessary." "All right," replied Tik-Tok, "but I do not think Ruggido would bleed if I filled him full of holes and put him in a cider press." Then the officers fell in line, the 4 generals abreast, and then the 4 colonels, and the 4 majors, and the 4 captains. They drew their glittering swords and commanded Tik-Tok to march, which he did. Twice he fell down, being tripped by the rough rocks, but when he struck the smooth path, he got along better. Into the gloomy mouth of the cavern entrance he stepped without hesitation, and after him proudly pranced the officers and Queen Anne. The others held back a little, waiting to see what would happen. Of course, the Nome King knew they were coming, and was prepared to receive them. Just within the rocky passage that led to the jeweled throne room was a deep pit, which was usually covered. Ruggedo had ordered the cover removed, and it now stood open, scarcely visible in the gloom. The pit was so large around that it nearly filled the passage, and there was barely room for one to walk around it by pressing close to the rock walls. This Tik-Tok did, for his copper eyes saw the pit clearly, and he avoided it. But the officers marched straight into the hole and tumbled in a heap on the bottom. An instant later, Queen Anne also walked into the pit, for she had her chin in the air and was careless where she placed her feet. Then one of the gnomes pulled a lever, which replaced the cover on the pit and made the officers of Oogaboo and their queen fast prisoners. As for Tik-Tok, he kept straight on to the cavern where Ruggedo sat in his throne, and there he faced the Nome King and said, "I hereby conquer you in the name of Queen Ann Soforth of Oogaboo, whose army I am, and I declare that you are her prisoner." Ruggedo laughed at him. "Where is this famous queen?" he asked. "She'll be here in a minute," said Tik-Tok. "Perhaps she stopped to tie her shoestring." "Now see here, Tik-Tok," began the Nome King in a stern voice. "I've had enough of this nonsense. Your queen and her officers are all prisoners, having fallen into my power. So perhaps you will tell me what you mean to do." "My orders were to conquer you," replied Tik-Tok, "and my machinery has done the best it knows how to carry out those orders." Ruggedo pounded on his gong, and Kaliko appeared, following closely by General Guff. "Take this copper man into the shops and set him to work hammering gold," commanded the king. "Being run by machinery, he ought to be a steady worker. He was never to have been made, but since he exists, I shall hereafter put him to good use." "If you try to capture me," said Tik-Tok, "I shall fight." "Don't do that," exclaimed General Guff earnestly, "for it will be useless to resist and you might hurt someone." But Tik-Tok raised his gun and took aim, and not knowing what damage the gun might do, the gnomes were afraid to face it. While he was thus defying the Nome King and his high officials, Betsy Bobbin rode calmly into the royal cavern, seated upon the back of Hank the mule. The little girl had grown tired of waiting for something to happen, and so had come to see if Ruggedo had been conquered. "Nails and nuggets," roared the king. "How dare you bring that beast here and enter my presence unannounced?" "There wasn't anybody to announce me," replied Betsy. "I guess your folks were all busy." "Are you conquered yet?" "No," shouted the king, almost beside himself with rage. "Then please give me something to eat, for I'm awfully hungry," said the girl. "You see, this conquering business is a good deal like waiting for a circus parade. It takes a long time to get around, and don't amount to much anyhow." The gnomes were so much astonished at this speech that for a time they could only glare at her silently, not finding words to reply. The king finally recovered the use of his tongue and said, "Earth-crawler, this insolence to my majesty shall be your death warrant. You are an ordinary mortal, and to stop a mortal from living is so easy a thing to do that I will not keep you waiting half so long as you did for my conquest." "I'd rather you wouldn't stop me from living," remarked Betsy, getting off Hank's back and standing beside him, "and it would be a pretty cheap king who killed a visitor while she was hungry. If you'll give me something to eat, I'll talk this killing business over with you afterward. Only, I warn you now that I don't approve of it, and never will." Her coolness and lack of fear impressed the Nome King, although he bore an intense hatred toward all mortals. "What do you wish to eat?" he asked gruffly. "Oh, a ham sandwich will do, or perhaps a couple of hard-boiled eggs." "Eggs!" shrieked the three gnomes who were present, shuddering till their teeth chattered. "What's the matter?" asked Betsy wonderingly. "Are eggs as high here as they are at home?" "Guff," said the king in an agitated voice, turning to his general, "let us destroy this rash mortal at once. Seize her, and take her to the slimy cave, and lock her in." Guff glanced at Tik-Tok, whose gun was still pointed, but just then Calico stole softly behind the copper man and kicked his knee joints so that they suddenly bent forward and tumbled Tik-Tok to the floor, his gun falling from his grasp. Then Guff, seeing Tik-Tok helpless, made a grab at Betsy. At the same time, Hank's heels shot out and caught the general just where his belt was buckled. He rose into the air swift as a cannonball, struck the Nome King fairly, and flattened his majesty against a wall of rock on the opposite side of the cavern. Together they fell to the floor in a dazed and crumpled condition, seeing which Calico whispered to Betsy, "Come with me quick, and I will save you." She looked into Calico's face inquiringly and thought he seemed honest and good-natured, so she decided to follow him. He led her and the mule through several passages and into a small cavern, very nicely and comfortably furnished. "This is my own room," said he, "but you are quite welcome to use it. Wait here a minute and I'll get you something to eat." When Calico returned, he brought a tray containing some broiled mushrooms, a loaf of mineral bread, and some petroleum butter. The butter Betsy could not eat, but the bread was good and the mushrooms delicious. "Here's the door key," said Calico, "and you'd better lock yourself in." "Won't you let Polychrome and the Rose Princess come here too?" she asked. "I'll see. Where are they?" "I don't know. I left them outside," said Betsy. "Well, if you hear 3 raps on the door, open it," said Calico. "But don't let anyone in unless they give you 3 raps." "All right," promised Betsy, and when Calico left the cozy cavern, she closed and locked the door. In the meantime, Anne and her officers, finding themselves prisoners in the pit, had shouted and screamed until they were tired out, but no one had come to their assistance. It was very dark and damp in the pit, and they could not climb out because the walls were higher than their heads and the cover was on. The Queen was first angry, and then annoyed, and then discouraged, but the officers were only afraid. Every one of the poor fellows heartily wished he was back in Oogaboo, caring for his orchard, and some were so unhappy that they began to reproach Anne for causing them all this trouble and danger. Finally, the Queen sat down on the bottom of the pit and leaned her back against the wall. By good luck, her sharp elbow touched a secret spring in the wall, and the big flat rock swung inward. Anne fell over backward, but the next instant she jumped up and cried to the others, "A passage! A passage! Follow me, my brave men, and we may yet escape." Then she began to crawl through the passage, which was as dark and dank as the pit, and the officers followed her in single file. They crawled, and they kept on crawling, for the passage was not big enough to allow them to stand upright. It turned this way and twisted that, sometimes like a corkscrew and sometimes zigzag, but seldom ran for long in a straight line. "It will never end, never," moaned the officers, who were rubbing all the skin off their knees on the rough rocks. "It must end," retorted Anne courageously, "or it never would have been made. We don't know where it will lead us to, but any place is better than that loathsome pit." So she crawled on, and the officers crawled on, and while they were crawling through this awful underground passage, Polychrome and Shaggy and Files and the Rose Princess, who were standing outside the entrance to Ruggedo's domains, were wondering what had become of them. Chapter 17. A Tragic Transformation. "Don't let us worry," said Shaggy to his companions, "for it may take the Queen some time to conquer the Metal Monarch, as Tik-Tok has to do everything in his slow, mechanical way." "Do you suppose they are likely to fail?" asked the Rose Princess. "I do indeed," replied Shaggy. "This Nome King is really a powerful fellow, and has a legion of gnomes to assist him, whereas our bold queen commands a clockwork man and a band of faint-hearted officers." "She ought to have let Quirks do the conquering," said Polychrome, dancing lightly upon a point of rock and fluttering her beautiful draperies. "But perhaps the dragon was wise to let her go first, for when she fails to conquer Ruggedo, she may become more modest in her ambitions." "Where is the dragon now?" inquired Ozga. "Up there on the rocks," replied Files. "Look, my dear, you may see him from here. He said he would take a little nap while we were mixing up with Ruggedo, and he added that after we had gotten into trouble, he would wake up and conquer the Nome King in a jiffy, as his master, the Gin-Gin, had ordered him to do." "Quirks means well," said Shaggy, "but I do not think we shall need his services, for just as soon as I am satisfied that Queen Anne and her army have failed to conquer Ruggedo, I shall enter the caverns and show the king my love magnet. That he cannot resist. Therefore, the conquest will be made with ease." This speech of Shaggy Man's was overheard by the long-eared hearer, who was at that moment standing by Ruggedo's side. For when the king and Guff had recovered from Hank's kick and had picked themselves up, their first act was to turn Tik-Tok on his back and put a heavy diamond on top of him, so that he could not get up again. Then they carefully put his gun in a corner of the cavern, and the king sent Guff to fetch the long-eared hearer. The hearer was still angry at Ruggedo for breaking his ear, but he acknowledged the Nome King to be his master and was ready to obey his commands. Therefore he repeated Shaggy's speech to the king, who at once realized that his kingdom was in grave danger, for Ruggedo knew of the love magnet and its powers, and was horrified at the thought that Shaggy might show him the magic talisman and turn all the hatred in his heart into love. Ruggedo was proud of his hatred and abhorred love of any sort. "Really," said he, "I'd rather be conquered and lose my wealth and my kingdom than gaze at that awful love magnet. What can I do to prevent the Shaggy Man from taking it out of his pocket?" Calico returned to the cavern in time to overhear this question, and, being a loyal gnome and eager to serve his king, he answered by saying, "If we can manage to bind the Shaggy Man's arms tight to his body, he could not get the love magnet out of his pocket." "True," cried the king in delight at this easy solution of the problem. "Get at once a dozen gnomes with ropes and place them in the passage where they can seize and bind Shaggy as soon as he enters." This Calico did, and meanwhile the watchers outside the entrance were growing more and more uneasy about their friends. "I don't worry so much about the Oogaboo people," said Polychrome, who had grown sober with waiting, and perhaps a little nervous, for they could not be killed, even though Ruggedo might cause them much suffering and, perhaps, destroy them utterly. But we should not have allowed Betsy and Hank to go alone into the caverns. The little girl is mortal and possesses no magic powers whatever, so if Ruggedo captures her, she will be wholly at his mercy. "That is indeed true," replied Shaggy. "I wouldn't like to have anything happen to dear little Betsy, so I believe I'll go in right away and put an end to all this worry." "We may as well go with you," asserted Files, "for by means of the love magnet, you can soon bring the Nome King to reason." So it was decided to wait no longer. Shaggy walked through the entrance first, and after him came the others. They had no thought of danger to themselves, and Shaggy, who was going along with his hands thrust into his pockets, was much surprised when a rope shot out from the darkness and twined around his body, pinning down his arms so securely that he could not even withdraw his hands from the pockets. Then appeared several grinning gnomes, who speedily tied knots in the ropes and then led the prisoner along the passage to the cavern. No attention was paid to the others, but Files and the princess followed on after Shaggy, determined not to desert their friend and hoping that an opportunity might arise to rescue him. As for Polychrome, as soon as she saw that trouble had overtaken Shaggy, she turned and ran lightly back through the passage and out of the entrance. Then she easily leaped from rock to rock until she paused beside the great dragon who lay fast asleep. "Wake up, Quox," she cried. "It is time for you to act." But Quox did not wake up. He lay as one in a trance, absolutely motionless, with his enormous eyes tightly closed. The eyelids had big silver scales on them, like the rest of his body. Polychrome might have thought Quox was dead had she not known that dragons do not die easily, or had she not observed his huge body swelling as he breathed. She picked up a piece of rock and pounded against his eyelids with it, saying, "Wake up, Quox, wake up!" But he would not waken. "Dear me, how unfortunate," sighed the lovely Rainbow's daughter. "I wonder what is the best and surest way to waken the dragon. All our friends may be captured and destroyed, while this great beast lies asleep." She walked around Quox 2 or 3 times, trying to discover some tender place on his body where a thump or a punch might be felt. But he lay extended along the rocks with his chin flat upon the ground and his legs drawn underneath his body, and all that one could see was his thick sky-blue skin, thicker than that of a rhinoceros, and his silver scales. Then, despairing at last of wakening the beast, and worried over the fate of her friends, Polychrome again ran down to the entrance, and hurried along the passage into the Nome King's cavern. Here she found Ruggedo lolling in his throne, and smoking a long pipe. Beside him stood General Guff and Calico, and ranged before the king were the Rose Princess, Files, and the Shaggy Man. Tik-Tok still lay upon the floor, weighted down by the big diamond. Ruggedo was now in a more contented frame of mind. One by one, he had met the invaders and easily captured them. The dreaded love magnet was indeed in Shaggy's pocket, only a few feet away from the king, but Shaggy was powerless to show it, and unless Ruggedo's eyes beheld the talisman, it could not affect him. As for Betsy Bobbin and her mule, he believed Calico had placed them in the slimy cave, while Ann and her officers he thought safely imprisoned in the pit. Ruggedo had no fear of Files or Ozga, but to be on the safe side, he had ordered golden handcuffs placed upon their wrists. These did not cause them any great annoyance, but prevented them from making an attack, had they been inclined to do so. The Nome King, thinking himself wholly master of the situation, was laughing and jeering at his prisoners when Polychrome, exquisitely beautiful and dancing like a ray of light, entered the cavern. "Oh!" cried the king. "A rainbow underground, eh?" And then he stared hard at Polychrome, and still harder, and then he sat up and pulled the wrinkles out of his robe and arranged his whiskers. "On my word," said he, "you are a very captivating creature. Moreover, I perceive you are a fairy." "I am Polychrome, the Rainbow's daughter," she said proudly. "Well," replied Ruggedo, "I like you. The others I hate. I hate everybody but you. Wouldn't you like to live always in this beautiful cavern, Polychrome? See, the jewels that stud the walls have every tint and color of your rainbow, and they are not so elusive. I'll have fresh dewdrops gathered for your feasting every day, and you shall be queen of all my gnomes and pull Calico's nose whenever you like." "No, thank you," laughed Polychrome. "My home is in the sky, and I'm only on a visit to this solid, sordid earth. But tell me, Ruggedo, why my friends have been wound with cords and bound with chains?" "They threatened me," answered Ruggedo. "The fools did not know how powerful I am." "Then, since they are now helpless, why not release them and send them back to the Earth's surface?" "Because I hate 'em and mean to make 'em suffer for their invasion. But I'll make a bargain with you, sweet Polly. Remain here and live with me, and I'll set all these people free. You shall be my daughter or my wife or my aunt or grandmother, whichever you like. Only stay here to brighten my gloomy kingdom and make me happy." Polychrome looked at him wonderingly. Then she turned to Shaggy and asked, "Are you sure he hasn't seen the love magnet?" "I'm positive," answered Shaggy, "but you seem to be something of a love magnet yourself, Polychrome." She laughed again and said to Ruggedo, "Not even to rescue my friends would I live in your kingdom, nor could I endure for long the society of such a wicked monster as you." "You forget," retorted the king, scowling darkly, "that you also are in my power." "Not so, Ruggedo. The Rainbow's Daughter is beyond the reach of your spite or malice. Seize her!" suddenly shouted the king, and General Guff sprang forward to obey. Polychrome stood quite still, yet when Guff attempted to clutch her, his hands met in air, and now the Rainbow's Daughter was in another part of the room, as smiling and composed as before. Several times Guff endeavored to capture her, and Ruggedo even came down from his throne to assist his general. But never could they lay hands upon the lovely Sky Fairy, who flitted here and there with the swiftness of light and constantly defied them with her merry laughter as she evaded their efforts. So, after a time they abandoned the chase, and Ruggedo returned to his throne and wiped the perspiration from his face with a finely woven handkerchief of cloth of gold. "Well," said Polychrome, "what do you intend to do now?" "I'm going to have some fun, to repay me for all my bother," replied the Nome King. Then he said to Calico, "Summon the executioners." Calico at once withdrew and presently returned with a score of gnomes, all of whom were nearly as evil-looking as their hated master. They bore great golden pincers and prods of silver, and clamps and chains, and various wicked-looking instruments, all made of precious metals, and set with diamonds and rubies. "Now, Pang," said Ruggedo, addressing the leader of the executioners, "fetch the army of Oogaboo and their queen from the pit and torture them here, in my presence, as well as in the presence of their friends. It'll be great sport." "I hear your majesty, and I obey your majesty," answered Pang, and went, with his gnomes, into the passage. In a few minutes he returned and bowed to Ruggedo. "They're all gone," said he. "Gone?" exclaimed the Nome King. "Gone where?" "They left no address, your majesty, but they are not in the pit." "Picks and puddles," roared the king. "Who took the cover off?" "No one," said Pang. "The cover was there, but the prisoners were not under it." "In that case," snarled the king, trying to control his disappointment, "go to the slimy cave and fetch hither the girl and the donkey. And while we are torturing them, Calico must take 100 gnomes and search for the escaped prisoners, the Queen of Oogaboo and her officers. If he does not find them, I will torture Calico." Calico went away looking sad and disturbed, for he knew the king was cruel and unjust enough to carry out this threat. Pang and the executioners also went away in another direction, but when they came back, Betsy Bobbin was not with them, nor was Hank. "There is no one in the slimy cave, your majesty," reported Pang. "Jumping jelly cakes," screamed the king. "Another escape? Are you sure you found the right cave?" "There is but one slimy cave, and there is no one in it," returned Pang, positively. Ruggedo was beginning to be alarmed as well as angry. However, these disappointments but made him the more vindictive, and he cast an evil look at the other prisoners and said, "Never mind the girl and the donkey. Here are 4 at least who cannot escape my vengeance. Let me see, I believe I'll change my mind about Tik-Tok. Have the gold crucible heated to a white, seething heat, and then we'll dump the copper man into it and melt him up." "But your Majesty," protested Calico, who had returned to the room after sending 100 gnomes to search for the Oogaboo people. "You must remember that Tik-Tok is a very curious and interesting machine. It would be a shame to deprive the world of such a clever contrivance." "Say another word and you'll go into the furnace with him," roared the king. "I'm getting tired of you, Calico, and the first thing you know I'll turn you into a potato and make Saratoga chips of you." "The next to consider," he added more mildly, "is the Shaggy Man. As he owns the love magnet, I think I'll transform him into a dove, and then we can practice shooting at him with Tik-Tok's gun. Now, this is a very interesting ceremony, and I beg you all to watch me closely and see that I've nothing up my sleeve." He came out of his throne to stand before the Shaggy Man, and then he waved his hands, palms downward, in 7 semicircles over his victim's head, saying in a low but clear tone of voice, the magic wooga. The effect of this well-known sorcery was instantaneous. Instead of the Shaggy Man, a pretty dove lay fluttering upon the floor, its wings confined by tiny cords wound around them. Ruggedo gave an order to Pang, who cut the cords with a pair of scissors. Being freed, the dove quickly flew upward and alighted on the shoulder of the Rose Princess, who stroked it tenderly. Very good," cried Ruggedo, rubbing his hands gleefully together. "One enemy is out of my way, and now for the others." Perhaps my readers should be warned not to attempt the above transformation, for although the exact magical formula has been described, it is unlawful in all civilized countries for anyone to transform a person into a dove by muttering the words Ruggedo used. There were no laws to prevent the Nome King from performing this transformation, but if it should be attempted by any other country, and the magic worked, the magician would be severely punished. When Polychrome saw Shaggy Man transformed into a dove and realized that Ruggedo was about to do something as dreadful to the Princess and Files, and that Tik-Tok would soon be melted into a crucible, she turned and ran from the cavern, through the passage and back to the place where Quokes lay asleep. Chapter 18. A Clever Conquest. The great dragon still had his eyes closed and was even snoring in a manner that resembled distant thunder. But Polychrome was now desperate, because any further delay meant the destruction of her friends. She seized the pearl necklace to which was attached the great locket and jerked it with all her strength. The result was encouraging. Quokes stopped snoring and his eyelids flickered. So Polychrome jerked again and again, till slowly the great lids raised and the dragon looked at her steadily. Said he, in a sleepy tone, "What's the matter, little rainbow?" "Come quick," exclaimed Polychrome. "Ruggedo has captured all our friends, and is about to destroy them." "Well, well," said Quokes, "I suspected that would happen. Step a little out of my path, my dear, and I'll make a rush for the Nome King's cavern." She fell back a few steps, and Quokes raised himself on his stout legs, whisked his long tail, and in an instant had slid down the rocks and made a dive through the entrance. Along the passage he swept, nearly filling it with his immense body, and now he poked his head into the jeweled cavern of Ruggedo. But the king had long since made arrangements to capture the dragon whenever he might appear. No sooner did Quokes stick his head into the room than a thick chain fell from above and encircled his neck. Then the ends of the chain were drawn tight, for in an adjoining cavern 1,000 gnomes were pulling on them, and so the dragon could advance no further toward the king. He could not use his teeth or his claws, and his body was still in the passage. he had not even room to strike his foes with his terrible tail. Ruggedo was delighted with the success of his stratagem. He had just transformed the Rose Princess into a fiddle and was about to transform Fowls into a fiddle bow when the dragon appeared to interrupt him. So he called out, "Welcome, my dear Quox, to my royal entertainment. Since you are here, you shall witness some very neat magic, and after I have finished with Files and Tik-Tok, I mean to transform you into a tiny lizard, one of the chameleon sort, and you shall live in my cavern and amuse me." "Pardon me for contradicting your majesty," returned Quox in a quiet voice, "but I don't believe you perform any more magic." "Eh? Why not?" asked the king, in surprise. "There's a reason," said Quox. "Do you see this ribbon around my neck? Yes? And I'm astonished that a dignified dragon should wear such a silly thing." "Do you see it plainly?" persisted the dragon, with a little chuckle of amusement. "I do," declared Ruggedo. "Then you no longer possess any magical powers, and are as helpless as a clam," asserted Quox. "My great master Tititi-Hoochoo, the Jinjin, enchanted this ribbon in such a way that, whenever your majesty looks upon it, all knowledge of magic would desert you instantly, nor will any magical formula you can remember ever perform your bidding." "Oh, I don't believe a word of it," cried Ruggedo, half frightened nevertheless. Then he turned toward Files and tried to transform him into a fiddle bow. But he could not remember the right words or the right pass of the hands, and, after several trials, he finally gave up the attempt. By this time, the Nome King was so alarmed that he was secretly shaking in his shoes. "I told you not to anger Tititi-Hoochoo," grumbled Kaliko, "and now you see the result of your disobedience." Ruggedo promptly threw his scepter at the royal chamberlain, who dodged it with his usual cleverness, and then he said with an attempt to swagger, "Never mind, I don't need magic to enable me to destroy these invaders. Fire and the sword will do the business, and I am still king of the gnomes and lord of my master of my underground kingdom." "Again, I beg to differ with your majesty," said Quox. "The great Jinjin commands you to depart instantly from this kingdom and seek the earth's surface, where you will wander for all time to come, without a home or country, without a friend or follower, and without any more riches than you can carry with you in your pockets. The great Jinjin is so generous that he will allow you to fill your pockets with jewels or gold, but you must take nothing more." Ruggedo now stared at the dragon in amazement. "Does Tititi-Hoochoo condemn me to such a fate?" he asked in a hoarse voice. "He does," said Quox. "And just for throwing a few strangers down the forbidden tube?" "Just for that," repeated Quox in a stern, gruff voice. "Well, I won't do it, and your crazy old Jinjin can't make me do it either," declared Ruggedo. "I intend to remain here, king of the gnomes, until the end of the world, and I defy your Tititi-Hoochoo and all his fairies, as well as his clumsy messenger, whom I have been obliged to chain up." The dragon smiled again, but it was not the sort of smile that made Ruggedo feel very happy. Instead, there was something so cold and merciless in the dragon's expression that the condemned Nome King trembled and was sick at heart. There was little comfort for Ruggedo in the fact that the dragon was now chained, although he had boasted of it. He glared at the immense head of Quox as if fascinated, and there was fear in the old king's eyes as he watched his enemy's movements. For the dragon was now moving, not abruptly but as if he had something to do and was about to do it. Very deliberately he raised one claw, touched the catch of the great jeweled locket that was suspended around his neck, and at once it opened wide. Nothing much happened at first. Half a dozen hens' eggs rolled out upon the floor, and then the locket closed with a sharp click. But the effect upon the gnomes of this simple thing was astounding. General Guff, Calico, Bang and his band of executioners were all standing close to the door that led to the vast series of underground caverns, which constituted the dominions of the gnomes. And as soon as they saw the eggs, they raised a chorus of frantic screams and rushed through the door, slamming it in Ruggedo's face and placing a heavy bronze bar across it. Ruggedo, dancing with terror and uttering loud cries, now leaped upon the seat of his throne to escape the eggs, which had rolled steadily toward him. Perhaps these eggs, sent by the wise and crafty Tititi-Hoochoo, were in some way enchanted, for they all rolled directly after Ruggedo, and when they reached the throne where he had taken refuge, they began rolling up the legs to the seat. This was too much for the king to bear. His horror of eggs was real and absolute, and he made a leap from the throne to the center of the room and then ran to a far corner. The eggs followed, rolling slowly but steadily in his direction. Ruggedo threw his scepter at them, and then his ruby crown, and then he drew off his heavy golden sandals and hurled these at the advancing eggs. But the eggs dodged every missile and continued to draw near. The king stood trembling, his eyes staring in terror, until they were but half a yard distant. Then, with an agile leap, he jumped clear over them and made a rush for the passage that led to the outer entrance. Of course, the dragon was in his way, being chained in the passage with his head in the cavern, but when he saw the king making toward him, he crouched as low as he could and dropped his chin to the floor, leaving a small space between his body and the roof of the passage. Ruggedo did not hesitate an instant. Impelled by fear, he leaped to the dragon's nose and then scrambled to his back, where he succeeded in squeezing himself through the opening. After the head was past, there was more room, and he slid along the dragon's scales to his tail, and then ran as fast as his legs would carry him to the entrance. Not pausing here, so great was his fright, the king dashed on down the mountain path. But before he had gone very far, he stumbled and fell. When he picked himself up, he observed that no one was following him, and while he recovered his breath, he happened to think of the decree of the Jinjin, that he should be driven from his kingdom and made a wanderer on the face of the earth. Well, here he was, driven from his cavern in truth, driven by those dreadful eggs, but he would go back and defy them. He would not submit to losing his precious kingdom and his tyrannical powers, all because Tititi-Hoochoo had said he must. So, although still afraid, Ruggedo nerved himself to creep back along the path to the entrance, and when he arrived there, he saw the 6 eggs lying in a row just before the arched opening. At first he paused a safe distance away to consider the case, for the eggs were now motionless. While he was wondering what could be done, he remembered there was a magical charm which would destroy eggs and render them harmless to gnomes. There were 9 passes to be made and 6 verses of incantation to be recited, but Ruggedo knew them all. Now that he had ample time to be exact, he carefully went through the entire ceremony. But nothing happened. The eggs did not disappear, as he had expected, so he repeated the charm a second time. Then that also failed. Then he remembered, with a moan of despair, that his magic power had been taken away from him, and in the future he could do no more than any common mortal. And they were eggs, forever bearing him from the kingdom which he had ruled so long with absolute sway. He threw rocks at them, but could not hit a single egg. He raved and scolded and tore his hair and beard, and danced in helpless passion, but that did nothing to avert the just judgment of the Jinjin, which Ruggedo's own evil deeds had brought upon him. From this time on, he was an outcast, a wanderer upon the face of the earth, and he had even forgotten to fill his pockets with gold and jewels before he fled from his former kingdom. Chapter 19. King Calico. After the king had made good his escape, Files said to the dragon in a sad voice. Alas, why did you not come before? Because you were sleeping instead of conquering? The lovely Rose Princess has become a fiddle without a bow, while poor Shaggy sits there a cooing dove. Don't worry, replied Quooks. Titity-Hoochoo knows his business, and I had my orders from the great Gingin himself. Bring the fiddle here and touch it lightly to my pink ribbon. Files obeyed, and at the moment of contact with the ribbon, the Nome King's charm was broken, and the Rose Princess herself stood before them, as sweet and smiling as ever. The dove, perched on the back of the throne, had seen and heard all this, so, without being told what to do, it flew straight to the dragon and alighted on the ribbon. Next instant, Shaggy was himself again, and Quooks said to him grumblingly, Please get off my left toe, Shaggy Man, and be more particular where you step. I beg your pardon, replied Shaggy, very glad to resume his natural form. Then he ran to lift the heavy diamond off Tik-Tok's chest, and to assist the Clockwork Man to his feet. Many thanks, said Tik-Tok. Where is the wicked king who wanted to melt me in a crucible? He has gone, and gone for good, answered Polychrome, who had managed to squeeze into the room beside the dragon and had witnessed the occurrences with much interest. But I wonder where Betsy Bobbin and Hank can be, and if any harm has befallen them. We must search the cavern until we find them, declared Shaggy. But when he went to the door leading to the other caverns, he found it shut and barred. I've a pretty strong push in my forehead, said Quooks, and I believe I can break down that door, even though it's made of solid gold. But you are a prisoner, and the chains that hold you are fastened in some other room, so that we cannot release you, Files said anxiously. Oh, never mind that, returned the dragon. I have remained a prisoner only because I wished to be one. And with this he stepped forward and burst the stout chains, as easily as if they had been threads. But when he tried to push in the heavy metal door, even his mighty strength failed, and after several attempts he gave it up and squatted himself in a corner to think of a better way. I'll open the door, asserted Tik-Tok, and going to the king's big gong, he pounded upon it until the noise was almost deafening. Calico in the next cavern was wondering what had happened to Raggedo and if he had escaped the eggs and outwitted the dragon. But when he heard the sound of the gong, which had so often called him into the king's presence, he decided that Raggedo had been victorious. So he took away the bar, threw open the door, and entered the royal cavern. Great was his astonishment to find the king gone, and the enchantments removed from the princess and Shaggy. But the eggs were also gone, and so Calico advanced to the dragon, whom he knew to be Titity-Hoochoo's messenger, and bowed humbly before the beast. What is your will? He inquired. Where is Betsy? Demanded the dragon. Safe in my own private room, said Calico. Go and get her, commanded Quooks. So Calico went to Betsy's room and gave 3 raps upon the door. The little girl had been asleep, but she heard the raps and opened the door. You may come out now, said Calico. The king has fled in disgrace, and your friends are asking of you. So Betsy and Hank returned with the royal chamberlain to the throne cavern, where she was received with great joy by her friends. They told her what had happened to Raggedo, and she told them how kind Calico had been to her. Quooks did not have much to say until the conversation was ended, but then he turned to Calico and asked, Do you suppose you could rule your gnomes better than Raggedo has done? Me? Stammered the chamberlain, greatly surprised by the question. Well, I couldn't be a worse king, I'm sure. Would the gnomes obey you? Inquired the dragon. Of course, said Calico. They like me better than ever they did Raggedo. Then hereafter you shall be the Metal Monarch, king of the gnomes, and Titity-Hoochoo expects you to rule your kingdom wisely and well, said Quooks. Hooray! Cried Betsy. I'm glad of that. King Calico, I salute your majesty, and wish you joy in your gloomy old kingdom. "We all wish him joy," said Polychrome, and then the others made haste to congratulate the new king. "Will you release my dear brother?" asked Shaggy. "The ugly one? Very willingly," replied Calico. "I begged Ruggedo long ago to send him away, but he would not do so. I also offered to help your brother to escape, but he would not go." "He's so conscientious," said Shaggy, highly pleased. "All of our family have noble natures, but is my dear brother well?" he added anxiously. "He eats and sleeps very steadily," replied the new king. "I hope he doesn't work too hard," said Shaggy. "He doesn't work at all. In fact, there is nothing he can do in these dominions as well as our gnomes, whose numbers are so great that it worries us to keep them all busy. So your brother has only to amuse himself." "Why, it's more like visiting than being a prisoner," asserted Betsy. "Not exactly," returned Calico. "A prisoner cannot go where or when he pleases, and is not his own master." "Where is my brother now?" inquired Shaggy. "In the Metal Forest." "Where is that?" "The Metal Forest is in the great domed cavern, the largest in all our dominions," replied Calico. "It is almost like being out of doors. It is so big, and Ruggedo made the wonderful forest to amuse himself, as well as to tire out his hard-working gnomes. All the trees are gold and silver, and the ground is strewn with precious stones, so it is a sort of treasury." "Let us go there at once and rescue my dear brother," pleaded Shaggy earnestly. Calico hesitated. "I don't believe I can find the way," said he. "Ruggedo made 3 secret passages to the Metal Forest, but he changes the location of these passages every week, so that no one can get to the Metal Forest without his permission. However, if we look sharp, we may be able to discover one of these secret ways." "That reminds me to ask what has become of Queen Anne and the officers of Oogaboo," said Files. "I'm sure I can't say," replied Calico. "Do you suppose Ruggedo destroyed them?" "Oh no, I'm quite sure he didn't. They fell into the big pit in the passage, and we put the cover on to keep them there. But when the executioners went to look for them, they had all disappeared from the pit, and we could find no trace of them." "That's funny," remarked Betsy thoughtfully. "I don't believe Anne knew any magic, or she'd have worked it before. But to disappear like that seems like magic now, doesn't it?" They agreed that it did, but no one could explain the mystery. "However," said Shaggy, "they are gone, that is certain, so we cannot help them or be helped by them. And the important thing just now is to rescue my dear brother from captivity." "Why do they call him the Ugly One?" asked Betsy. "I do not know," confessed Shaggy. "I cannot remember his looks very well. It is so long since I have seen him, but all of our family are noted for their handsome faces." Betsy laughed and Shaggy seemed rather hurt, but Polychrome relieved his embarrassment by saying softly, "One can be ugly in looks, but lovely in disposition." "Our first task," said Shaggy, a little comforted by this remark, "is to find one of those secret passages to the Metal Forest." "True," agreed Calico, "so I think I will assemble the chief gnomes of my kingdom in this throne room and tell them that I am their new king. Then I can ask them to assist us in searching for the secret passages." "That's a good idea," said the dragon, who seemed to be getting sleepy again. Calico went to the big gong and pounded on it just as Ruggedo used to do, but no one answered the summons. "Of course not," said he, jumping up from the throne where he had seated himself. "That is my call, and I am still the royal chamberlain, and will be until I appoint another in my place." So he ran out of the room and found Guff and told him to answer the summons of the king's gong. Having returned to the royal cavern, Calico first pounded the gong and then sat in the throne, wearing Ruggedo's discarded ruby crown and holding in his hand the scepter which Ruggedo had so often thrown at his head. When Guff entered, he was amazed. "Better get out of that throne before old Ruggedo comes back," he said warningly. "He isn't coming back, and I am now the king of the gnomes in his stead." announced Calico. All of which is quite true, asserted the dragon, and all of those who stood around the throne bowed respectfully to the new king. Seeing this, Guff also bowed, for he was glad to be rid of such a hard master as Ragado. Then Calico, in quite a kingly way, informed Guff that he was appointed the royal chamberlain and promised not to throw the scepter at his head unless he deserved it. All this being pleasantly arranged, the new chamberlain went away to tell the news to all the gnomes of the underground kingdom, every one of whom would be delighted with the change in kings. Chapter 20. Quox quietly quits. When the chief gnomes assembled before their new king, they joyfully saluted him and promised to obey his commands. But when Calico questioned them, none knew the way to the metal forest, although all had assisted in its making. So the king instructed them to search carefully for one of the passages and to bring him the news as soon as they had found it. Meantime, Quox had managed to back out of the rocky corridor and so regain the open air and his old station on the mountainside. And there he lay upon the rocks, sound asleep until the next day. The others of the party were all given as good rooms as the caverns of the gnomes afforded, for King Calico felt that he was indebted to them for his promotion and was anxious to be as hospitable as he could. Much wonderment had been caused by the absolute disappearance of the 16 officers of Oogaboo and their queen. Not a gnome had seen them, nor were they discovered during the search for the passages leading to the metal forest. Perhaps no one was unhappy over their loss, but all were curious to know what had become of them. On the next day, when our friends went to visit the dragon, Quox said to them, "I must now bid you goodbye, for my mission here is finished, and I must depart for the other side of the world, where I belong." "Will you go through the tube again?" asked Betsy. "To be sure, but it will be lonely. Such a lonely trip this time, with no one to talk to, and I cannot invite any of you to go with me. Therefore, as soon as I slide into the hole, I shall go to sleep, and when I pop out at the other end, I will wake up at home." They thanked the dragon for befriending them, and wished him a pleasant journey. Also they sent their thanks to the great Jinjin, whose just condemnation of Ragado had served their interests so well. Then Quox yawned and stretched himself and ambled over to the tube, into which he slid head foremost, and disappeared. They really felt as if they had lost a friend, for the dragon had been both kind and sociable during their brief acquaintance with him. But they knew it was his duty to return to his own country. So they went back to the caverns to renew the search for the hidden passages that led to the forest. But for 3 days, all efforts to find them proved in vain. It was Polychrome's custom to go every day to the mountain and watch for her father, the rainbow, for she was growing tired with wandering upon the earth and longed to rejoin her sisters in their sky palaces. And on the 3rd day, while she sat motionless upon a point of rock, whom should she see slyly creeping up the mountain but Ragado? The former king looked very forlorn. His clothes were soiled and torn, and he had no sandals upon his feet or hat upon his head. Having left his crown and scepter behind when he fled, the old gnome no longer seemed kingly, but more like a beggar man. Several times had Ragado crept up to the mouth of the caverns, only to find the 6 eggs still on guard. He knew quite well that he must accept his fate and become a homeless wanderer, but his chief regret now was that he had neglected to fill his pockets with gold and jewels. He was aware that a wanderer with wealth at his command would fare much better than one who was a pauper, so he still loitered around the caverns wherein he knew so much treasure was stored, hoping for a chance to fill his pockets. That was how he came to recollect the metal forest. "Aha," said he to himself, "I alone know the way to that forest, and once there I can fill my pockets with the finest jewels in all the world." He glanced at his pockets and was grieved to find them so small. Perhaps they might be enlarged so that they would hold more. He knew of a poor woman who lived in a cottage at the foot of the mountain, so he went to her and begged her to sew pockets all over his robe, paying her with the gift of a diamond ring which he had worn upon his finger. The woman was delighted to possess so valuable a ring, and she sewed as many pockets on Ruggedo's robe as she possibly could. Then he returned up the mountain and, after gazing cautiously around to make sure he was not observed, he touched a spring in a rock, and it swung slowly backward, disclosing a broad passageway. This he entered, swinging the rock in place behind him. However, Ruggedo had failed to look as carefully as he might have done, for Polychrome was seated only a little distance off, and her clear eyes marked exactly the manner in which Ruggedo had released the hidden spring. So she rose and hurried into the cavern, where she told Calico and her friends of her discovery. "I've no doubt that is a way to the metal forest," exclaimed Shaggy. "Come, let us follow Ruggedo at once and rescue my poor brother." They agreed to this, and King Calico called together a band of gnomes to assist them by carrying torches to light their way. "The metal forest has a brilliant light of its own," said he, "but the passage across the valley is likely to be dark." Polychrome easily found the rock and touched the spring, so in less than an hour after Ruggedo had entered, they were all in the passage and following swiftly after the former king. "He means to rob the forest, I'm sure," said Calico, "but he will find he is no longer of any account in this kingdom, and I will have my gnomes throw him out." "Then please throw him as hard as you can," said Betsy, "for he deserves it. I don't mind an honest out-and-out enemy who fights square, but changing girls into fiddles and ordering 'em put into slimy caves is mean and tricky, and Ruggedo doesn't deserve any sympathy. But you have to let him take as much treasure as he can get in his pockets, Calico." "Yes, the Gingin said so, but we won't miss it much. There is more treasure in the metal forest than 1,000,000 gnomes could carry in their pockets." It was not difficult to walk through this passage, especially when the torches lighted the way. So they made good progress, but it proved to be a long distance, and Betsy had tired herself with walking and was seated upon the back of the mule when the passage made a sharp turn, and a wonderful and glorious light burst upon them. The next moment they were all standing upon the edge of the marvelous metal forest. It lay under another mountain and occupied a great domed cavern, the roof of which was higher than a church steeple. In this space the industrious gnomes had built, during many years of labor, the most beautiful forest in the world. The trees, trunks, branches and leaves were all of solid gold, while the bushes and underbrush were formed of filigree silver, virgin pure. The trees towered as high as natural live oaks do, and were of exquisite workmanship. On the ground were thickly strewn precious gems of every hue and size, while here and there among the trees were paths pebbled out with cut diamonds of the clearest water. Taken all together, more treasure was gathered in this metal forest than is contained in all the rest of the world, if we accept the land of Oz, where perhaps its value is equalled in the famous Emerald City. Our friends were so amazed at the sights that for a while they stood gazing in silent wonder. Then Shaggy exclaimed, "My brother, my dear lost brother, is he indeed a prisoner in this place?" "Yes," replied Calico. "The ugly one, who has been here for 2 or 3 years, to my positive knowledge." But what could he find to eat? Inquired Betsy. It's an awfully swell place to live in, but one can't breakfast on rubies and diamonds or even gold. One doesn't need to, my dear, Calico assured her. The metal forest does not fill all of this great cavern by any means. Beyond these gold and silver trees are other trees of the real sort, which bear foods very nice to eat. Let us walk in that direction, for I am quite sure we will find Shaggy's brother in that part of the cavern, rather than in this. So they began to tramp over the diamond-pebbled paths, and at every step they were more and more bewildered by the wondrous beauty of the golden trees with their glittering foliage. Suddenly they heard a scream. Jewels scattered in every direction, as someone hidden among the bushes scampered away before them. Then a loud voice cried, "Halt!" And there was the sound of a struggle. Chapter 21. A Bashful Brother. With fast-beating hearts, they all rushed forward and, beyond a group of stately metal trees, came full upon a most astonishing scene. There was Ruggedo in the hands of the officers of Oogaboo, a dozen of whom were clinging to the old gnome and holding him fast in spite of his efforts to escape. There was also Queen Anne, looking grimly upon the scene of strife, but when she observed her former companions approaching, she turned away in a shamefaced manner. For Anne and her officers were indeed a sight to behold. Her Majesty's clothing, once so rich and gorgeous, was now worn and torn into shreds by her long crawl through the tunnel, which, by the way, had led her directly into the metal forest, for it was indeed one of the 3 secret passages, and by far the most difficult of the 3. Anne had not only torn her pretty skirt and jacket, but her crown had become bent and battered, and even her shoes were so cut and slashed that they were ready to fall from her feet. The officers had fared somewhat worse than their leader, for holes were worn in the knees of their trousers, while sharp points of rock in the roof and sides of the tunnel had made rags of every inch of their once brilliant uniforms. A more tattered and woeful army never came out of a battle than these harmless victims of the rocky passage. But it had seemed their only means of escape from the cruel Nome King, so they had crawled on regardless of their sufferings. When they reached the metal forest, their eyes beheld more plunder than they had ever dreamed of, yet they were prisoners in this huge dome, and could not escape with the riches heaped about them. Perhaps a more unhappy and homesick lot of conquerors never existed than this band from Oogaboo. After several days of wandering in their marvelous prison, they were frightened by the discovery that Ruggedo had come among them. Rendered desperate by their sad condition, the officers exhibited courage for the first time since they left home, and, ignorant of the fact that Ruggedo was no longer king of the gnomes, they threw themselves upon him and had just succeeded in capturing him when their fellow adventurers reached the spot. "Goodness gracious," cried Betsy. "What has happened to you all?" Anne came forward to greet them, sorrowful and indignant. "We were obliged to escape from the pit through a small tunnel which was lined with sharp and jagged rocks," said she, "and not only was our clothing torn to rags, but our flesh is so bruised and sore that we are stiff and lame in every joint. To add to our troubles, we find we are still prisoners, but now that we have succeeded in capturing the wicked metal monarch, we shall force him to grant us our liberty." "Ruggedo is no longer metal monarch or king of the gnomes," Files informed her. "He has been deposed and cast out of his kingdom by Quox, but here is the new king, whose name is Calico, and I am pleased to assure your Majesty that he is our friend." "Glad to meet your Majesty, I'm sure," said Calico, bowing as courteously as if The Queen still wore splendid raiment. The officers, having heard this explanation, now set Ruggedo free, but as he had no place to go, he stood by and faced his former servant, who was now king in his place, in a humble and pleading manner. "What are you doing here?" asked Calico sternly. "Why, I was promised as much treasure as I could carry in my pockets," replied Ruggedo, "so I came here to get it, not wishing to disturb your majesty." "You were commanded to leave the country of the gnomes forever," declared Calico. "I know, and I'll go as soon as I have filled my pockets," said Ruggedo meekly. "Then fill them and be gone," returned the new king. Ruggedo obeyed. Stooping down, he began gathering up jewels by the handful and stuffing them into his many pockets. They were heavy things, these diamonds and rubies and emeralds and amethysts and the like, so before long, Ruggedo was staggering with the weight he bore, while the pockets were not yet filled. When he could no longer stoop over without falling, Betsy and Polychrome and the Rose Princess came to his assistance, picking up the finest gems and tucking them into his pockets. At last, these were all filled, and Ruggedo presented a comical sight, for surely no man ever before had so many pockets, or any at all filled with such a choice collection of precious stones. He neglected to thank the young ladies for their kindness, but gave them a surly nod of farewell and staggered down the path by the way he had come. They let him depart in silence, for, with all he had taken, the masses of jewels upon the ground seemed scarcely to have been disturbed, so numerous were they. Also, they hoped they had seen the last of the degraded king. "I'm awful glad he's gone," said Betsy, sighing deeply. "If he doesn't get reckless and spend his wealth foolishly, he's got enough to start a bank when he gets to Oklahoma." "But my brother, my dear brother, where is he?" inquired Shaggy anxiously. "Have you seen him, Queen Anne?" "What does your brother look like?" asked the Queen. Shaggy hesitated to reply, but Betsy said, "He's called the Ugly One. Perhaps you'll know him by that." "The only person we have seen in this cavern," said Anne, "has run away from us whenever we approached him. He hides over yonder, among the trees that are not gold, and we have never been able to catch sight of his face. So I cannot tell whether he is ugly or not." "That must be my dear brother," exclaimed Shaggy. "Yes, it must be," assented Calico. "No one else inhabits this splendid dome, so there can be no mistake." "But why does he hide among those green trees, instead of enjoying all these glittery golden ones?" asked Betsy. "Because he finds food among the natural trees," replied Calico. "And I remember that he has built a little house there to sleep in. As for these glittery golden trees, I will admit they are very pretty at first sight. One cannot fail to admire them, as well as the rich jewels scattered beneath them. But if one has to look at them always, they become pretty tame." "I believe that is true," declared Shaggy. "My dear brother is very wise to prefer real trees to the imitation ones. But come, let us go there and find him." Shaggy started for the green grove at once, and the others followed him, being curious to witness the final rescue of his long-sought, long-lost brother. Not far from the edge of the grove, they came upon a small hut, cleverly made of twigs and golden branches woven together. As they approached the place, they caught a glimpse of a form that darted into the hut and slammed the door tight shut after him. Shaggy Man ran to the door and cried aloud, "Brother, brother!" "Who calls?" demanded a sad, hollow voice from within. "It is Shaggy, your own loving brother, who has been searching for you a long time, and has now come to rescue you." "Too late," replied the gloomy voice. "No one can rescue me now." "Oh, but you are mistaken about that," said Shaggy. "There is a new king of the gnomes called Calico in Ruggedo's place, and he has promised you shall go free." "Free? I dare not go free," said the ugly one in a voice of despair. "Why not, brother?" asked Shaggy anxiously. "Do you know what they have done to me?" came the answer through the closed door. "No, tell me, brother, what have they done?" "When Ruggedo first captured me, I was very handsome. Don't you remember, Shaggy?" "Not very well, brother. You were so young when I left home. But I remember that Mother thought you were beautiful." "She was right. I'm sure she was right," wailed the prisoner. "But Ruggedo wanted to injure me, to make me ugly in the eyes of all the world. So he performed a wicked enchantment. I went to bed beautiful, or you might say handsome. To be very modest, I will merely claim that I was good-looking, and I wakened the next morning the homeliest man in all the world. I am so repulsive that when I look in the mirror, I frighten myself." "Poor brother," said Shaggy softly, and all the others were silent from sympathy. "I was so ashamed of my looks," continued the voice of Shaggy's brother, "that I tried to hide, but the cruel King Ruggedo forced me to appear before all the legion of gnomes, to whom he said, 'Behold, the ugly one.' But when the gnomes saw my face, they all fell to laughing and jeering, which prevented them from working at their tasks. Seeing this, Ruggedo became angry and pushed me into a tunnel, closing the rock entrance so that I could not get out. I followed the length of the tunnel until I reached this huge dome where the marvelous metal forest stands, and here I've remained ever since." "Poor brother," repeated Shaggy, "but I beg you now to come forth and face us, who are your friends. None here will laugh or jeer, however unhandsome you may be." "No, indeed," they all added pleadingly. But the ugly one refused the invitation. "I cannot," said he. "Indeed, I cannot face strangers, ugly as I am." Shaggy Man turned to the group surrounding him. "What shall I do?" he asked, in sorrowful tones. "I cannot leave my dear brother here, and he refuses to come out of that house and face us." "I'll tell you," replied Betsy. "Let him put on a mask." "The very idea I was seeking," exclaimed Shaggy joyfully. And then he called out, "Brother, put a mask over your face, and then none of us can see what your features are like." "I have no mask," answered the ugly one. "Look here," said Betsy. "He can use my handkerchief." Shaggy looked at the little square of cloth and shook his head. "It isn't big enough," he objected. "I'm sure it isn't big enough to hide a man's face, but he can use mine." Saying this, he took from his pocket his own handkerchief and went to the door of the hut. "Here, my brother," he called, "take this handkerchief and make a mask of it. I will also pass you my knife so that you may cut holes for the eyes, and then you must tie it over your face." The door slowly opened, just far enough for the ugly one to thrust out his hand and take the handkerchief and the knife. Then it closed again. "Don't forget a hole for your nose," cried Betsy. "You must breathe, you know." For a time there was silence. Queen Anne and her army sat down upon the ground to rest. Betsy sat on Hank's back. Polychrome danced lightly up and down the jeweled paths, while Files and the princess wandered through the groves arm in arm. Tik-Tok, who never tired, stood motionless. By and by, a noise sounded from within the hut. "Are you ready?" asked Shaggy. "Yes, brother," came the reply, and the door was thrown open to allow the ugly one to step forth. Betsy might have laughed aloud had she not remembered how sensitive to ridicule Shaggy's brother was, for the handkerchief with which he had masked his features was a red one covered with big white polka dots. In this, 2 holes had been cut in front of the eyes, while 2 smaller ones before the nostrils allowed the man to breathe freely. The cloth was then tightly drawn over the ugly one's face and knotted at the back of his neck. He was dressed in clothes that had been once good, but now were sadly worn and frayed. His silk stockings had holes in them, and his shoes were stub-toed and needed blackening. "But what can you expect," whispered Betsy, "when the poor man has been a prisoner for so many years?" Shaggy had darted forward and embraced his newly found brother with both his arms. The brother also embraced Shaggy, who then led him forward and introduced him to all the assembled company. "This is the new Nome King," he said when he came to Calico. "He is our friend and has granted you your freedom." "That is a kindly deed," replied Ugly in a sad voice, "but I dread to go back to the world in this direful condition. Unless I remain forever masked, my dreadful face would curdle all the milk and stop all the clocks." "Can't the enchantment be broken in some way?" inquired Betsy. Shaggy looked anxiously at Calico, who shook his head. "I'm sure I can't break the enchantment," he said. Ruggedo was fond of magic and learned a good many enchantments that we gnomes know nothing of. "Perhaps Ruggedo himself might break his own enchantment," suggested Anne, "but unfortunately we have allowed the old king to escape." "Never mind, my dear brother," said Shaggy consolingly. "I'm very happy to have found you again, although I may never see your face. So let us make the most of this joyful reunion." The ugly one was affected to tears by this tender speech, and the tears began to wet the red handkerchief, so Shaggy gently wiped them away with his coat sleeve. Chapter 22. Kindly Kisses. "Won't you be dreadful sorry to leave this lovely place?" Betsy asked the ugly one. "No, indeed," said he. "Jewels and gold are cold and heartless things, and I'm sure I would presently have died of loneliness had I not found this natural forest at the edge of the artificial one. Anyhow, without these real trees, I should soon have starved to death." Betsy looked around at the quaint trees. "I don't just understand that," she admitted. "What could you find to eat here?" "The best food in the world," Ugly answered. "Do you see that grove at your left?" he added, pointing it out. "Well, such trees as those do not grow in your country or in any other place but this cavern. I have named them hotel trees because they bear a certain kind of table d'hôte fruit called 3-course nuts." "That's funny," said Betsy. "What are the 3-course nuts like?" "Something like coconuts to look at," explained the ugly one. "All you have to do is to pick one of them and then sit down and eat your dinner. You first unscrew the top part and find a cupful of good soup. After you've eaten that, you unscrew the middle part and find a hollow filled with meat and potatoes, vegetables and a fine salad. Eat that and unscrew the next section, and you come to the dessert in the bottom of the nut. That is pie and cake, cheese and crackers, and nuts and raisins. The 3-course nuts are not all exactly alike in flavor or in contents, but they are all good, and in each one may be found a complete 3-course dinner." "But how about breakfast?" inquired Betsy. "Why, there are breakfast trees for that, which grow over there at the right. They bear nuts, like the others, only the nuts contain coffee or chocolate instead of soup, oatmeal instead of meat and potatoes, and fruits instead of dessert. Sad as has been my life in this wonderful prison, I must admit that no one could live more luxuriously in the best hotel in the world than I have lived here. But I will be glad to get into the open air again and see the good old sun and the silvery moon and the soft green grass and the flowers that are kissed by the morning dew. Ah, how much more lovely are those blessed things than the glitter of gems or the cold gleam of gold. Of course, said Betsy. I once knew a little boy who wanted to catch the measles because all the little boys in his neighborhood but him had had 'em, and he was really unhappy because he couldn't catch them, try as he would. So I'm pretty certain that the things we want and can't have are not good for us. Isn't that true, Shaggy? Not always, my dear, he gravely replied. If we didn't want anything, we would never get anything, good or bad. I think our longings are natural, and if we act as nature prompts us, we can't go far wrong. For my part, said Queen Anne, I think the world would be a dreary place without the gold and jewels. All things are good in their way, said Shaggy, but we may have too much of any good thing. And I have noticed that the value of anything depends upon how scarce it is and how difficult it is to obtain. Pardon me for interrupting you, said King Calico, coming to their side, but now that we have rescued Shaggy's brother, I would like to return to my royal cavern. Being the king of the gnomes, it is my duty to look after my restless subjects and see that they behave themselves. So they all turned and began walking through the metal forest to the other side of the great domed cave, where they had first entered it. Shaggy and his brother walked side by side, and both seemed rejoiced that they were together after their long separation. Betsy didn't dare look at the polka dot handkerchief for fear she would laugh aloud, so she walked behind the two brothers and led Hank by holding fast to his left ear. When at last they reached the place where the passage led to the outer world, Queen Anne said in a hesitating way that was unusual with her, I have not conquered this gnome country, nor do I expect to do so, but I would like to gather a few of these pretty jewels before I leave this place. Help yourself, ma'am, said King Calico, and at once the officers of the army took advantage of his royal permission and began filling their pockets, while Anne tied a lot of diamonds in a big handkerchief. This accomplished, they all entered the passage, the gnomes going first to light the way with their torches. They had not proceeded far when Betsy exclaimed, Why, there are jewels here too! All eyes were turned upon the ground, and they found a regular trail of jewels strewn along the rock floor. This is queer, said Calico, much surprised. I must send some of my gnomes to gather up these gems and replace them in the metal forest where they belong. I wonder how they came to be here. All along the passage they found this trail of jewels, but when they neared the end, the mystery was explained, for there, squatted upon the floor with his back to the rock wall, sat old Ruggedo, puffing and blowing as if he was all tired out. Then they realized it was he who had scattered the jewels from his many pockets, which one by one had burst with the weight of their contents as he had stumbled along the passage. But I don't mind, said Ruggedo with a deep sigh. I now realize that I could not have carried such a weighty load very far, even had I managed to escape from this passage with it. The woman who sewed the pockets on my robe used poor thread, for which I shall thank her. Have you any jewels left? Inquired Betsy. He glanced into some of the remaining pockets. A few, said he, but they will be sufficient to supply my wants, and I no longer have any desire to be rich. If some of you will kindly help me to rise, I'll get out of here and leave you, for I know you all despise me and prefer my room to my company. Shaggy and Calico raised the old king to his feet when he was confronted by Shaggy's brother, whom he now noticed for the first time. The queer and unexpected appearance of the ugly one so startled Ruggedo that he gave a wild cry and began to tremble as if he had seen a ghost. Who is this? He faltered. I am that helpless prisoner whom your cruel magic transformed from a handsome man into an ugly one, answered Shaggy's brother, in a voice of stern reproach. Really, Ruggedo, said Betsy, you ought to be ashamed of that mean trick. I am, my dear, admitted Ruggedo, who was now as meek and humble as formerly he had been cruel and vindictive. Then, returned the girl, you'd better do some more magic and give the poor man his own face again. I wish I could, answered the old king, but you must remember that Titichi-Hoochoo has deprived me of all my magic powers. However, I never took the trouble to learn just how to break the charm I cast over Shaggy's brother, for I intended he should always remain ugly. Every charm, remarked Pretty Polychrome, has its antidote, and if you knew this charm of ugliness, Ruggedo, you must have known how to dispel it. He shook his head. If I did, I've forgotten, he stammered regretfully. Try to think, pleaded Shaggy anxiously. Please, try to think. Ruggedo ruffled his hair with both hands, sighed, slapped his chest, rubbed his ear, and stared stupidly around the group. I've a faint recollection that there was one thing that would break the charm, said he, but misfortune has so addled my brain that I can't remember what it was. See here, Ruggedo, said Betsy sharply, we've treated you pretty well so far, but we won't stand for any nonsense, and if you know what's good for yourself, you will think of that charm. Why, he demanded, turning to look wonderingly at the little girl. Because it means so much to Shaggy's brother. He is dreadfully ashamed of himself, the way he is now, and you're to blame for it. Fact is, Ruggedo, you've done so much wickedness in your life that it won't hurt you to do a kind act now. Ruggedo blinked at her and sighed again, and then tried very hard to think. I seem to remember dimly, said he, that a certain kind of a kiss will break the charm of ugliness. What kind of a kiss? What kind? Why, it was either the kiss of a mortal maid, or the kiss of a mortal maid who had once been a fairy, or the kiss of one who is still a fairy. I can't remember which, but of course no maid, mortal or fairy, would ever consent to kiss a person so ugly, so dreadfully, fearfully, terribly ugly as Shaggy's brother. I'm not so sure of that, said Betsy with admirable courage. I'm a mortal maid, and if it is my kiss that will break this awful charm, I'll do it. Oh, you really couldn't, protested Ugly. I would be obliged to remove my mask, and when you saw my face, nothing could induce you to kiss me, generous as you are. Well, as for that, said the little girl, I needn't see your face at all. Here's my plan. You stay in this dark passage, and we'll send away the gnomes with their torches. Then you'll take off their handkerchief, and I'll kiss you. This is awfully kind of you, Betsy, said Shaggy, gratefully. Well, it surely won't kill me, she replied, and if it makes you and your brother happy, I'm willing to take some chances. So Calico ordered the torchbearers to leave the passage, which they did by going through the rock opening. Queen Anne and her army also went out, but the others were so interested in Betsy's experiment that they remained grouped at the mouth of the passageway. When the big rock swung into place, closing tight the opening, they were left in total darkness. Now then, called Betsy in a cheerful voice, have you got that handkerchief off your face, Ugly? Yes, he replied. Well, where are you then? She asked, reaching out her arms. Here, said he. You'll have to stoop down, you know. He found her hands, and clasping them in his own, stooped until his face was near to that of the little girl. The others heard a clear, smacking kiss, and then Betsy exclaimed, There, I've done it, and it didn't hurt a bit. Tell me, dear brother, is the charm broken? Asked Shaggy. I do not know, was the reply. It may be, or it may not be. I cannot tell. Has anyone a match? Inquired Betsy. I have several. Then let Ruggedo strike one of them and look at your brother's face, while we all turn our backs. Ruggedo made your brother ugly, so I guess he can stand the horror of looking at him, if the charm isn't broken. Agreeing to this, Ruggedo took the match and lighted it. He gave one look and then blew out the match. "Ugly as ever," he said with a shudder. So it wasn't the kiss of a mortal maid after all. "Let me try," proposed the Rose Princess in her sweet voice. "I am a mortal maid who was once a fairy. Perhaps my kiss will break the charm." Files did not wholly approve of this, but he was too generous to interfere. So the Rose Princess felt her way through the darkness to Shaggy's brother and kissed him. Ruggedo struck another match while they all turned away. "No," announced the former king, "that didn't break the charm. It must be the kiss of a fairy that is required, or else my memory has failed me altogether." "Polly," said Betsy pleadingly, "won't you try?" "Of course I will," answered Polychrome with a merry laugh. "I've never kissed a mortal man in all the thousands of years I've existed. But I'll do it to please our faithful Shaggy Man, whose unselfish affection for his ugly brother deserves to be rewarded." Even as Polychrome was speaking, she tripped lightly to the side of the ugly one and quickly touched his cheek with her lips. "Oh, thank you, he fervently cried. "I've changed this time, I know, I can feel it. I'm different. Shaggy, dear Shaggy, I'm myself again." Files, who was near the opening, touched the spring that released the big rock, and it suddenly swung backward and let in a flood of daylight. Everyone stood motionless, staring hard at Shaggy's brother, who, no longer masked by the polka-dot handkerchief, met their gaze with a glad smile. "Well," said Shaggy Man, breaking the silence at last, and drawing a long, deep breath of satisfaction. "You are no longer the ugly one, my dear brother, but to be entirely frank with you, the face that belongs to you is no more handsome than it ought to be." "I think he's rather good-looking," remarked Betsy, gazing at the man critically. "In comparison with what he was," said King Calico, "he is really beautiful. You who never beheld his ugliness may not understand that, but it was my misfortune to look at the ugly one many times, and I say again that, in comparison with what he was, the man is now beautiful." "All right," returned Betsy briskly. "We'll take your word for it, Calico. And now, let's get out of this tunnel and into the world again." Chapter 23. Ruggedo Reforms. It did not take them long to regain the royal cavern of the Nome King, where Calico ordered it to be served to them the nicest refreshments the place afforded. Ruggedo had come trailing along after the rest of the party, and while no one paid any attention to the old king, they did not offer any objection to his presence or command him to leave them. He looked fearfully to see if the eggs were still guarding the entrance, but they had now disappeared, so he crept into the cavern after the others and humbly squatted down in a corner of the room. There Betsy discovered him. All of the little girl's companions were now so happy at the success of Shaggy's quest for his brother, and the laughter and merriment seemed so general that Betsy's heart softened toward the friendless old man who had once been their bitter enemy, and she carried to him some of the food and drink. Ruggedo's eyes filled with tears at this unexpected kindness. He took the child's hand in his own and pressed it gratefully. "Look here, Calico," said Betsy, addressing the new king. "What's the use of being hard on Ruggedo? All his magic power is gone, so he can't do any more harm, and I'm sure he's sorry he acted so badly to everybody." "Are you?" asked Calico, looking down at his former master. "I am," said Ruggedo. "The girl speaks truly. I'm sorry, and I'm harmless. I don't want to wander through the wide world on top of the ground, for I'm a gnome. No gnome can ever be happy any place but underground." "That being the case," said Calico, I will let you stay here as long as you behave yourself, but if you try to act badly again, I shall drive you out as Tititi-Hoochoo has commanded, and you have to wonder." "Never fear, I'll behave," promised Ruggedo. "It is hard work being a king, and harder still to be a good king. But now that I am a common gnome, I am sure I can lead a blameless life." They were all pleased to hear this, and to know that Ruggedo had really reformed. "I hope he'll keep his word," replied Betsy to Shaggy. "But if he gets bad again, we will be far away from the Gnome Kingdom, and Calico will have to tend to the old gnome himself." Polychrome had been a little restless during the last hour or two. The lovely daughter of the rainbow knew that she had now done all in her power to assist her Earth friends, and so she began to long for her sky home. "I think," she said, after listening intently, "that it is beginning to rain. The Rain King is my uncle, you know, and perhaps he has read my thoughts and is going to help me. Anyway, I must take a look at the sky and make sure." So she jumped up and ran through the passage to the outer entrance, and they all followed after her and grouped themselves on the ledge of the mountainside. Sure enough, dark clouds had filled the sky, and a slow, drizzling rain had set in. "It can't last for long," said Shaggy, looking upward. "And when it stops, we shall lose the sweet little fairy we have learned to love. Alas," he continued after a moment, "the clouds are already breaking in the west, and see, isn't that the rainbow coming?" Betsy didn't look at the sky. She looked at Polychrome, whose happy, smiling face surely foretold the coming of her father to take her to the cloud palaces. A moment later, a gleam of sunshine flooded the mountain, and a gorgeous rainbow appeared. With a cry of gladness, Polychrome sprang upon a point of rock and held out her arms. Straightway the rainbow descended until its end was at her very feet, when with a graceful leap she sprang upon it and was at once clasped into the arms of her radiant sisters, the daughters of the rainbow. But Polychrome released herself to lean over the edge of the glowing arch and nod and smile and throw a dozen kisses to her late comrades. "Goodbye," she called, and they all shouted goodbye in return and waved their hands to their pretty friend. Slowly, the magnificent bow lifted and melted into the sky, until the eyes of the earnest watchers saw only fleecy clouds flitting across the blue. "I'm dreadful sorry to see Polychrome go," said Betsy, who felt like crying, "but I suppose she'll be a good deal happier with her sisters in the sky palaces." "To be sure," returned Shaggy, nodding gravely. "It's her home, you know, and those poor wanderers who, like ourselves, have no home, can realize what that means to her." "Once," said Betsy, "I too had a home. Now I've only dear old Hank." She twined her arms around her shaggy friend, who was not human, and he said, "Hee-haw," in a tone that showed he understood her. And the shaggy friend, who was human, stroked the child's head tenderly and said, "You're wrong about that, Betsy dear. I will never desert you." "Nor I," exclaimed Shaggy's brother in earnest tones. The little girl looked up at them gracefully, and her eyes smiled through her tears. "All right," she said, "it's raining again, so let's go back into the cavern." Rather soberly, for all loved Polychrome and would miss her, they re-entered the dominions of the Nome King. Chapter 24. Dorothy is Delighted. "Well," said Queen Anne, when all were again seated in Calico's royal cavern, "I wonder what we shall do next. If I could find my way back to Oogaboo, I'd take my army home at once, for I'm sick and tired of these dreadful hardships." "Don't you want to conquer the world?" asked Betsy. "No, I've changed my mind about that," admitted the Queen. "The world is too big for one person to conquer, and I was happier with my own people in Oogaboo." I wish, oh, how earnestly I wish, that I was back there this minute." "So do I," yelled every officer in a fervent tone. Now it is time for the reader to know that in the faraway land of Oz, the lovely ruler Ozma had been following the adventures of her Shaggy Man and Tik-Tok and all the others they had met. Day by day, Ozma, with the wonderful Wizard of Oz seated beside her, had gazed upon a magic picture in a radium frame, which occupied one side of the ruler's cozy boudoir in the palace of the Emerald City. The singular thing about this magic picture was that it showed whatever scene Ozma wished to see, with the figures all in motion, just as it was taking place. So Ozma and the wizard had watched every action of the adventurers from the time Shaggy had met shipwrecked Betsy and Hank in the Rose Kingdom, at which time the Rose Princess, a distant cousin of Ozma, had been exiled by her heartless subjects. When Anne and her people so earnestly wished to return to Oogaboo, Ozma was sorry for them, and remembered that Oogaboo was a corner of the land of Oz. She turned to her attendant and asked, "Cannot your magic take these unhappy people to their old home, wizard?" "It can, your highness," replied the little wizard. "I think the poor queen has suffered enough in her misguided effort to conquer the world," said Ozma, smiling at the absurdity of the undertaking. "So no doubt she will hereafter be contented in her own little kingdom. Please send her there, wizard, and with her the officers and files." "How about the Rose Princess?" asked the wizard. "Send her to Oogaboo with files," answered Ozma. "They have become such good friends that I'm sure it would make them unhappy to separate them." "Very well," said the wizard, and without any fuss or mystery whatever, he performed a magical rite that was simple and effective. Therefore those seated in the Nome King's cavern were both startled and amazed when all the people of Oogaboo suddenly disappeared from the room, and with them the Rose Princess. At first they could not understand it at all, but presently Shaggy suspected the truth, and believing that Ozma was now taking an interest in the party, he drew from his pocket a tiny instrument which he placed against his ear. Ozma, observing this action in her magic picture, at once caught up a similar instrument from a table beside her and held it to her own ear. The two instruments recorded the same delicate vibrations of sound and formed a wireless telephone, an invention of the wizard. Those separated by any distance were thus enabled to converse together with perfect ease and without any wire connection. "Do you hear me, Shaggy Man?" asked Ozma. "Yes, your highness," he replied. "I have sent the people of Oogaboo back to their own little valley," announced the ruler of Oz, "so do not worry over their disappearance." "That was very kind of you," said Shaggy, "but your highness must permit me to report that my own mission here is now ended. I have found my lost brother, and he is now beside me, freed from the enchantment of ugliness which Ruggedo cast upon him. Tik-Tok has served me and my comrades faithfully, as you requested him to do, and I hope you will now transport the Clockwork Man back to your fairyland of Oz." "I will do that," replied Ozma. "But how about yourself, Shaggy?" "I have been very happy in Oz," he said, "but my duty to others forces me to exile myself from that delightful land. I must take care of my newfound brother, for one thing, and I have a new comrade in a dear little girl named Betsy Bobbin, who has no home to go to, and no other friends but me and a small donkey named Hank. I have promised Betsy never to desert her as long as she needs a friend, and so I must give up the delights of the land of Oz forever." He said this with a sigh of regret, and Ozma made no reply, but laid the tiny instrument on her table, thus cutting off all further communication with the Shaggy Man. But the lovely ruler of Oz still watched her magic picture with a thoughtful expression upon her face, and the little Wizard of Oz watched Ozma and smiled softly to himself. In the cavern of the Nome King, Shaggy replaced the wireless telephone in his pocket and, turning to Betsy, said in as cheerful a voice as he could muster. "Well, little comrade, what shall we do next?" "I don't know, I'm sure," she answered, with a puzzled face. "I'm kind of sorry our adventures are over, for I enjoyed them, and now that Queen Anne and her people are gone, and Polychrome is gone, and, dear me, where's Tik-Tok, Shaggy?" "He's also disappeared," said Shaggy, looking around the cavern and nodding wisely. "By this time, he's in Ozma's palace in the land of Oz, which is his home." "Isn't it your home too?" asked Betsy. "It used to be, my dear, but now my home is wherever you and my brother are. We are wanderers, you know, but if we stick together, I'm sure we shall have a good time." "Then," said the girl, "let us get out of this stuffy underground cavern and go in search of new adventures. I'm sure it has stopped raining." "I'm ready," said Shaggy, and then they bade goodbye to King Calico and thanked him for his assistance and went out to the mouth of the passage. The sky was now clear and a brilliant blue in colour. The sun shone brightly, and even this rugged, rocky country seemed delightful after their confinement underground. There were but 4 of them now, Betsy and Hank and Shaggy and his brother, and the little party made their way down the mountain and followed a faint path that led toward the southwest. During this time, Ozma had been holding a conference with the wizard, and later with Tik-Tok, whom the magic of the wizard had quickly transported to Ozma's palace. Tik-Tok had only words of praise for Betsy Bobbin, who, he said, is almost as nice as Dorothy herself. "Let us send for Dorothy," said Ozma, and summoning her favourite maid, who was named Jellia Jam, she asked her to request Princess Dorothy to attend her at once. So, a few moments later, Dorothy entered Ozma's room and greeted her and the wizard and Tik-Tok with the same gentle smile and simple manner that had won for the little girl the love of everyone she met. "Did you want to see me, Ozma?" she asked. "Yes, dear. I am puzzled how to act, and I want your advice." "I don't believe it's worth much," replied Dorothy, "but I'll do the best I can. What is it all about, Ozma?" "You all know," said the girl ruler, addressing her 3 friends, "what a serious thing it is to admit any mortals into this fairyland of Oz. It is true I have invited several mortals to make their home here, and all of them have proved true and loyal subjects. Indeed, no one of you 3 was a native of Oz. Dorothy and the wizard came here from the United States, and Tik-Tok came from the land of Ev. But of course, he's not a mortal. Shaggy is another American, and he is the cause of all my worry, for our dear Shaggy will not return here and desert the new friends he has found in his recent adventures, because he believes they need his services." "Shaggy Man was always kind-hearted," remarked Dorothy. "But who are these new friends he has found?" "One is his brother, who for many years has been a prisoner of the Nome King, our old enemy Ruggedo. This brother seems a kindly, honest fellow, but he has done nothing to entitle him to a home in the land of Oz." "Who else?" asked Dorothy. "I've told you about Betsy Bobbin, the little girl who was shipwrecked in much the same way you once were, and has since been following the Shaggy Man in his search for his lost brother. You remember her, do you not?" "Oh yes," exclaimed Dorothy. "I've often watched her and Hank in the magic picture, you know. She's a dear little girl, and old Hank is a darling. Where are they now?" "Look and see," replied Ozma with a smile at her friend's enthusiasm. Dorothy turned to the picture, which showed Betsy and Hank, with Shaggy and his brother, trudging along the rocky paths of a barren country. "Seems to me," she said musingly, "that they're a good way from any place to sleep, or any nice things to eat." "You are right," said Tik-Tok. "I have been in that country, and it is a wilderness." "It is the country of the gnomes," explained the wizard, "who are so mischievous that no one cares to live near them. I'm afraid Shaggy and his friends will endure many hardships before they get out of that rocky place, unless—" He turned to Ozma and smiled. "Unless I ask you to transport them all here?" she asked. "Yes, Your Highness." "Could your magic do that?" inquired Dorothy. "I think so," said the wizard. "Well," said Dorothy, "as far as Betsy and Hank are concerned, I'd like to have them here in Oz. It would be such fun to have a girl playmate of my own age, you see, and Hank is such a dear little mule." Ozma laughed at the wistful expression in the girl's eyes, and then she drew Dorothy to her and kissed her. "Am I not your friend and playmate?" she asked. Dorothy flushed. "You know how dearly I love you, Ozma," she cried, "but you're so busy ruling all this land of Oz that we can't always be together." "I know, dear. My first duty is to my subjects, and I think it would be a delight to us all to have Betsy with us. There's a pretty suite of rooms just opposite your own where she can live, and I'll build a golden stall for Hank in the stable where the sawhorse lives. Then we'll introduce the mule to the cowardly lion and the hungry tiger, and I'm sure they will soon become firm friends. But I cannot very well admit Betsy and Hank into Oz unless I also admit Shaggy's brother. And unless you admit Shaggy's brother, you will keep out poor Shaggy, whom we are all very fond of," said the wizard. "Well, why not admit him?" demanded Tik-Tok. "The land of Oz is not a refuge for all mortals in distress," explained Ozma. "I do not wish to be unkind to Shaggy Man, but his brother has no claim on me." "The land of Oz isn't crowded," suggested Dorothy. "Then you advise me to admit Shaggy's brother?" inquired Ozma. "Well, we can't afford to lose our Shaggy Man, can we?" "No, indeed," returned Ozma. "What do you say, wizard? I'm getting my magic ready to transport them all. And you, Tik-Tok? Shaggy's brother is a good fellow, and we can't spare Shaggy. So then, the question is settled," decided Ozma. "Perform your magic, wizard." He did so, placing a silver plate upon a small standard and pouring upon the plate a small quantity of pink powder, which was contained in a crystal vial. Then he muttered a rather difficult incantation which the sorceress Glinda the Good had taught him, and it all ended in a puff of perfumed smoke from the silver plate. This smoke was so pungent that it made both Ozma and Dorothy rub their eyes for a moment. "You must pardon these disagreeable fumes," said the wizard. "I assure you the smoke is a very necessary part of my wizardry." "Look!" cried Dorothy, pointing to the magic picture. "They're gone! All of them are gone." Indeed, the picture now showed the same rocky landscape as before, but the three people and the mule had disappeared from it. "They are gone," said the wizard, polishing the silver plate and wrapping it in a fine cloth, "because they are here." At that moment, Jellia Jam entered the room. "Your Highness," she said to Ozma, "the Shaggy Man and another man are in the waiting room and ask to pay their respects to you. Shaggy is crying like a baby, but he says they are tears of joy." "Send them here at once, Jellia," commanded Ozma. "Also," continued the maid, "a girl and a small-sized mule have mysteriously arrived, but they don't seem to know where they are or how they came here. Shall I send them here too?" "Oh no!" exclaimed Dorothy, eagerly jumping up from her chair. "I'll go to meet Betsy myself, for she'll feel awful strange in this big palace." And she ran down the stairs 2 at a time to greet her new friend, Betsy Bobbin. Chapter 25. The Land of Love. "Well, is he-haw all you are able to say?" inquired the sawhorse as he examined Hank with his knot eyes and slowly wagged the branch that served him for a tail. They were in a beautiful stable in the rear of Ozma's palace, where the wooden sawhorse, very much alive, lived in a gold-panelled stall, and where there were rooms for the cowardly lion and the hungry tiger, which were filled with soft cushions for them to lie upon and golden troughs for them to eat from. Beside the stall of the sawhorse had been placed another for Hank, the mule. This was not quite so beautiful as the other, for the sawhorse was Ozma's favourite steed, but Hank had a supply of cushions for a bed, which the sawhorse did not need because he never slept. And all this luxury was so strange to the little mule that he could only stand still and regard his surroundings and his queer companions with wonder and amazement. The Cowardly Lion, looking very dignified, was stretched out upon the marble floor of the stable, eyeing Hank with a calm and critical gaze, while nearby crouched the huge hungry tiger, who seemed equally interested in the new animal that had just arrived. The sawhorse, standing stiffly before Hank, repeated his question. "Is hee-haw all you are able to say?" Hank moved his ears in an embarrassed manner. "I have never said anything else until now," replied Hank, and then he began to tremble with fright to hear himself talk. "I can well understand that," remarked the lion, wagging his great head with a swaying motion. "Strange things happen in this land of Oz, as they do everywhere else. I believe you came here from the cold, civilized outside world, did you not?" "I did," replied Hank. "One minute I was outside of Oz, and the next minute I was inside. That was enough to give me a nervous shock, as you may guess, but to find myself able to talk as Betsy does is a marvel that staggers me." "That is because you are in the land of Oz," said the sawhorse. "All animals talk in this favoured country, and you must admit it is more sociable than to bray your dreadful hee-haw, which nobody can understand." "Mules understand it very well," declared Hank. "Oh, indeed? Then there must be other mules in your outside world," says the tiger, yawning sleepily. "There are a great many in America," said Hank. "Are you the only tiger in Oz?" "No," acknowledged the tiger. "I have many relatives living in the jungle country, but I am the only tiger living in the Emerald City." "There are other lions too," said the sawhorse, "but I am the only horse of any description in this favoured land." "That is why this land is favoured," said the tiger. "You must understand, friend Hank, that the sawhorse puts on airs because he is shod with plates of gold, and because our beloved ruler, Ozma of Oz, likes to ride upon his back." "Betsy rides upon my back," declared Hank proudly. "Who is Betsy?" "The dearest, sweetest girl in all the world." The sawhorse gave an angry snort and stamped his golden feet. The tiger crouched and growled. Slowly the great lion rose to his feet, his mane bristling. "Friend Hank," said he, "either you are mistaken in judgment or you are willfully trying to deceive us. The dearest, sweetest girl in the world is our Dorothy, and I will fight anyone, animal or human, who dares to deny it." "So will I," snarled the tiger, showing 2 rows of enormous white teeth. "You are all wrong," asserted the sawhorse in a voice of scorn. "No girl can compare with my mistress, Ozma of Oz." Hank slowly turned around until his heels were toward the others. Then he said stubbornly, "I am not mistaken in my statement, nor will I admit there can be a sweeter girl alive than Betsy Bobbin. If you want to fight, come on, I'm ready for you." While they hesitated, eyeing Hank's heels doubtfully, a merry peal of laughter startled the animals, and turning their heads, they beheld 3 lovely girls standing just within the richly carved entrance to the stable. In the centre was Ozma, her arms encircling the waists of Dorothy and Betsy, who stood on either side of her. Ozma was nearly half a head taller than the 2 other girls, who were almost of one size. Unobserved, they had listened to the talk of the animals, which was a very strange experience indeed to little Betsy Bobbin. "You foolish beasts," exclaimed the ruler of Oz, in a gentle but chiding tone of voice. "Why should you fight to defend us, who are all 3 loving friends and in no sense rivals? Answer me," she continued, as they bowed their heads sheepishly. "I have the right to express my opinion, your highness," pleaded the lion. "And so have the others," replied Ozma. "I'm glad you and the hungry tiger loved Dorothy best, for she was your first friend and companion. Also, I am pleased that my sawhorse loves me best, for together we have endured both joy and sorrow. Hank has proved his faith and loyalty by defending his own little mistress. And so you are, all right in one way, but wrong in another. Our land of Oz is a land of love, and here, friendship outranks every other quality. Unless you can all be friends, you cannot retain our love. They accepted this rebuke very meekly. All right, said the Sawhorse quite cheerfully. Shake hoofs, friend mule. Hank touched his hoof to that of the wooden horse. Let us be friends and rub noses, said the tiger. So Hank modestly rubbed noses with the big beast. The lion merely nodded and said, as he crouched before the mule, Any friend of our beloved ruler is a friend of the cowardly lion. That seems to cover your case. If ever you need help or advice, friend Hank, call on me. Why, this is as it should be, said Ozma, highly pleased to see them so fully reconciled. Then she turned to her companions. Come, my dears, let us resume our walk. As they turned away, Betsy said wonderingly, Do all the animals in Oz talk as we do? Almost all, answered Dorothy. There's a yellow hen here, and she can talk, and so can her chickens, and there's a pink kitten upstairs in my room, and the kitten talks very nicely. But I've a little fuzzy black dog, named Toto, who has been with me in Oz a long time, and he has never said a single word but bow wow. Do you know why? Asked Ozma. Why, he's a Kansas dog, so I suppose he's different from these fairy animals, replied Dorothy. Hank isn't a fairy animal any more than Toto, said Ozma. Yet as soon as he came under the spell of our fairyland, he found he could talk. It was the same way with Billina, the yellow hen whom you brought here at one time. The same spell has affected Toto, I assure you. But he's a wise little dog, and while he knows everything that is said to him, he prefers not to talk. Goodness me, exclaimed Dorothy. I never expected Toto was fooling me all this time. Then she drew a small silver whistle from her pocket and blew a shrill note upon it. A moment later, there was a sound of scurrying footsteps, and a shaggy black dog came running up the path. Dorothy knelt down before him, and, shaking her finger just above his nose, she said, Toto, haven't I always been good to you? Toto looked up at her with his bright black eyes and wagged his tail. Bow wow, he said, and Betsy knew at once. That meant yes, as well as Dorothy and Ozma, who knew it, for there was no mistaking the tone of Toto's voice. That's a dog's answer, said Dorothy. How would you like it, Toto, if I said nothing to you but bow wow? Toto's tail was wagging furiously now, but otherwise he was silent. Really, Dorothy, said Betsy, he can talk with his bark and his tail just as well as we can. Don't you understand such dog language? Of course I do, replied Dorothy, but Toto's got to be more sociable. See here, sir, she continued, addressing the dog. I've just learned for the first time that you can say words if you want to. Don't you want to, Toto? Woof, said Toto, and that meant no. Not just one word, Toto, to prove you're as good as any other animal in Oz. Woof! Just one word, Toto, and then you may run away. He looked at her steadily a moment. All right, here I go, he said, and darted away as swift as an arrow. Dorothy clapped her hands in delight, while Betsy and Ozma both laughed heartily at her pleasure and the success of her experiment. Arm in arm they sauntered away through the beautiful gardens of the palace, where magnificent flowers bloomed in abundance and fountains shot their silvery sprays far into the air. And by, as they turned a corner, they came upon Shaggy Man and his brother, who were seated together upon a golden bench. The two arose to bow respectfully as the ruler of Oz approached them. How are you enjoying our land of Oz? Ozma asked the stranger. I'm very happy here, your highness, replied Shaggy's brother. Also, I am very grateful to you for permitting me to live in this delightful place. You must thank Shaggy for that, said Ozma. Being his brother, I have made you welcome here. When you know brother better, said Shaggy earnestly, you'll be glad he has become one of your loyal subjects. I'm just getting acquainted with him myself, and I find much in his character to admire. Leaving the brothers, Ozma and the girls continued their walk. Presently, Betsy exclaimed, "Shaggy's brother can't ever be as happy in Oz as I am. Do you know, Dorothy, I didn't believe any girl could ever have such a good time anywhere as I am having now." "I know," answered Dorothy. "I felt that way myself lots of times. I wish," continued Betsy dreamily, "that every little girl in the world could live in the land of Oz, and every little boy too." Ozma laughed at this. "It is quite fortunate for us, Betsy, that your wish cannot be granted," she said, "for all that army of girls and boys would crowd us so that we would have to move away." "Yes," agreed Betsy, after a little thought. "I guess that's true." The end. This has been Tik-Tok of Oz by L. Frank Baum, narrated by Sam Kusi.